I am Father Chris Hoffman. I am the co-chair of Faith in Volusia County, Florida, and also a board member of DART. And it's good that you're together with us again this morning. So as we always do, are my folks from Faith here? Faith moves mountains. There we go. All right. If you please turn to page 6 in your agenda booklet, we'll review our day. This morning, I am very pleased and honored that my bishop, Bishop Noonan, is here to join with us, and he'll share a few words in a few minutes. And also the Faith and Peace organizations from our own diocese will be leading devotions this morning. Then, as you see on the agenda, we'll have 2 more scripture studies, text studies in the morning, and then Dr. Pickett will lead us in that. We thank you again for doing that last night or yesterday afternoon and sharing with us his insights. Also then, following that, you'll see that we have an issue panel again, and there'll be 4 individuals who will come forward at that time after our break. Then we are very pleased and honored to have Cardinal Turkson from Rome, who will be with us later this morning. That will be an exciting time to share with us, and he'll be introduced by Archbishop Wensky from Miami. Then, of course, later on, after Cardinal speaks, we will also have response from several speakers, and then we'll have our lunch following that. So that's our morning with us, and we're glad that you're with us. Also, there's one change to our agenda later in the morning, that instead of Father Dan Knoll from Build, there'll be Father Greg Hammes from Topeka Jump. He'll be sharing with us as well. So with that said, I invite Bishop Noonan to please come forward to share with us his welcome and opening remarks.
Again, thank you. It's always good to be with you. I'm kind of being cautious because sometimes I get up in front of a microphone and I give a homily that I'm preparing, so I want to be very careful. I focus on what I'm supposed to be doing. But first of all, as I said, thank you for the good work you do, and it is very good work. And I thank you also because every year you come here to Orlando and you give me this opportunity to be with you. And just to hear the issues that you're talking about and to realize how important that we have a lot of agendas or we have a lot of challenges to face in our daily lives. I'm glad to see some of our priests here. We joked about a lot of the priests are dressed in clerics today. You noticed that? It's not because the bishop is coming, it's because the cardinal is coming, So what would Francis say about that? But I'm not going to say anything about that, I think, in a special way, I thanked our priests. I'm joking with them now, guys, don't worry. But I think I'm glad to see you here because, we have to take up the mantle of justice and recognize the calling, we have, though we are leaders. And I'm talking to all of you, not just our priests, but all who are religious leaders. You have a mandate to really, truly, and it comes basically from Matthew's gospel. A mandate to look after those who are homeless, those who are hungry, those who are forgotten, those above all who are brothers and sisters in the Lord. There are challenges. There are many challenges in our world today, like there will always be. Homelessness. The streets are not the place for the poor. The streets are not the place for the mentally ill. So we have a responsibility to care, to look after, and above all, recognize the dignity of all human beings. Youth arrests. These are issues that I hear about every day. But again, I don't believe that handcuffs or felony records are the way to deal with young people and even children. We have to really, truly look at the problems and deal with the issues rather than think we have solutions. In my life, and especially because working in prisons, I often think of that the only way we deal with our problems is punitive. There's no rehabilitation. And that's a challenge for our whole culture and society. Faith and Peace have been working hard to combat these problems, and I congratulate you. We have some victories, we have some challenges, but I hope and pray we still do not give up really the challenges. For me, I too see other things: affordable housing, opiate addiction, pornography. All of these are basically what I would call curses to our society, because they take the most vulnerable, they destroy them, and in a sense, let them be forgotten. Our local Catholic charities offices have worked with Faith, and together with them, we have won many different grants. $8 million grant for the Homeless Assistance Center that will open early in 2019, I think in Volusia County. In Polk County, Peace, over $30 million each year has been secured for health care, including much needed for mental illness. Again, our homelessness. So we do have successes, and yet we need to have a voice, and the people need to hear the voice. Just as in the Old Testament we had the prophets, today sometimes the voices are not being heard. Pope Francis said, we have created new idols. He said in a speech in the Vatican, the worship of the golden calf of old has found new and heartless images in the cult of money and the dictatorship of economy, which is faceless and lacking any true human goal. Where are the poor? Where are the homeless? Where are the young? Where are the forgotten? They're in our midst, but we are their voice. I understand that the essential work of DART organization is standing against these cultures, false cultures, the cult of money. In addition to the work of our local organizations, we here in Orlando are working to end human trafficking, when humans are thought of as a commodity to be bought and sold. There is the epitome of worshiping money and vaulting that over human life. It is sad to think that Orlando is the home of entertainment, family entertainment, yet human trafficking is one of our biggest problems. Again, I encourage you as you gather here today, and I encourage you more than anything else to be that voice, even though it's so hard. But I leave you with the words of Pope Francis when he said recently, when Christians forget about hope, when they forget about tenderness, they become a cold, cold church that loses its sense of direction and is held back by ideologies and worldly attitudes. Whereas God's simplicity tells you to go out, to go forward, to go to the peripheries, hearing the word of God say, I am your Father who loves you. So as I welcome you here today, I encourage you to be that voice of those who are sometimes forgotten. Thank you.
Good morning. We are from Peace in Polk County, Florida.
Peace shows up, justice reigns.
And we are from Faith in Volusia County, Florida. Faith
Moves mountains.
This morning we will be reflecting on the second point of the Dark Credo. If you will turn to page 2. We will read that statement together. We stand over and against the cult of money. The cult of money uses consumer culture to promote stories of scarcity, hate, fear, despair, and meism. In opposition to the biblical story, meaning comes from accumulating more and better things, i.e., greed.
Our scripture will be coming from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 20. reading from the New International Version. Now, what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven, so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God's word for God's people, and may you be blessed.
We at Peace and Faith want to, first of all, thank again Bishop Noonan for his support of our organizations, because without it, this work of justice could not continue. So we are very thankful for that. You probably remember the show Let's Make a Deal. In that show, contestants in funny costumes would be selected to choose a box or a curtain or an envelope. They would get that envelope, excuse me, that would contain, let's say, $200. They would then choose to keep that money and go home, or they could trade it for what was behind that curtain or under that box. Often they discovered that if they let go of that sure thing for what was behind the curtain, they got a year's supply of Dinty Moore beef stew. Not at all what they were hoping for. Where was that car, that jet ski, that trip? Game shows are like that. But life is like that too. How often do we settle for Pharaoh's narrative rather than for the bounty of God? That we don't choose life, we choose false gods. Our forefathers knew that we would often choose poorly. We would settle for the cheap solutions offered by the world rather than honor the God who loves us. In Daytona Beach, we have the International Speedway Corporation. They are the organizing group that puts together the NASCAR races and other races around the country. Daytona is often known by NASCAR fans for the Daytona 500. And that'll be run next weekend. This is a huge deal. Thousands, tens of thousands will come to Daytona over the next 2 weeks. Lots of money to be made, or so it goes. Our county council knows the dollars that are spent in our area during race weeks. So it was not unheard of for them to offer deals to the Speedway and NASCAR. In fact, they gave $40 million from the county funds, from our taxpayer dollars, to make sure that what the Speedway Corporation wanted, they got. Now, Faith comes along and reveals to them that there are over 5,000 homeless men and women each day that have no place to go in Volusia County. We need the county to spend $4 million to provide a safe place for our homeless. It should be a place that will help them get on their feet, get help with medical and mental health problems. This shelter makes sense from an economic point of view. It makes sense from a moral point of view. But, as we heard, there's no money for that. Right. But faith would not go away. For 5 years, we challenged our county officials and the city of Daytona Beach to work together to find that money that they could so easily give to the Speedway Corporation. Finally, in 2017, they did so. They chose to commit $8 million of city and county money to finally provide a place for those who are most vulnerable, a place for those who will never watch a NASCAR race, but a place that will provide help and comfort.
Peace stood over and against the cult of money this past year and years before while working on youth arrest and the opportunity for them to have civil citation and diversion, to have hope. We were getting serious pushback from our previous state attorney, Jerry Hill, and couldn't understand why he was so against diverting our children prior to an arrest. We learned that the cult of money was the reason. A child who was diverted couldn't be charged arrest fees by the state attorney office. We learned that the state had cut the budgets of state attorney offices so much that they balanced their budgets by charging fees to families and children for arrest charges. The cult of money was put above the future of our children, and in reality, our own future. But we didn't stand for it. We pushed our county to prioritize our children, and in just the first 5 months, after getting a commitment from our new state attorney and sheriff, we have now diverted 361 children. Yes. For when peace shows up,
Justice reigns.
For the final prayer, I will use a prayer that I borrowed from Sister Margaret Mary. I hope you don't mind. It's the peace prayer. Peace prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me show love. Where there is injury, pardon. When there is doubt, faith. When there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Eternal Father, we ask you to guide us in our daily life and to guide us in our conversations, in our discussions during this day. Enlighten us and strengthen us in our daily life. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
If I could now, I surely would stand on the rock where Moses stood. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, now, Mary, don't you weep. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't mourn. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, now, Mary, don't you weep. Mary wore 3 links of chain. Every link there was Jesus' name. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Mary, don't you weep, don't mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't mourn. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, now, Mary, don't you weep.
We now invite Dr. Pickett once more to come join with us and to share with us our next text study.
Good morning, everybody. Hope you enjoyed your 2 extra hours of being awake today. Before we start, I don't want to be here without saying, I hope this is assumed, but without saying how much I appreciate the work that you do and how nourishing it is to my soul to be here and to hear the stories of sort of on-the-ground transformation around justice. This is why I come to these things, to be reminded of why I do what I do, so I appreciate it very much. We're going to look at a couple more texts this morning, and I'm just going to frame them a little bit, but I want to do that. I want to begin by kind of reminding us what we're doing, because the reason that we started off with this sort of broad framing of Mark, the whole narrative, is to really teach you a lens. And I think I've had some conversation, many conversations, and I think some of you are starting to see this. So this is like putting on a new pair of glasses, right? To look at the things kind of from a structural or systemic point of view. And once you, we're not used to doing that, because we kind of operate with a personalism, with relationship to God and to the text. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is just another way, it's another lens to look at this. And the value is precisely has to do with the work that you do around justice, where you have to see things not just from an individual point of view, but from the standpoint of structures and systems. I think there's another value to this for our work, and that is that it depersonalizes things, right? In other words, it's a way of thinking about, so we're going to look at the 2 texts this way. It's a way of thinking about how all of us, every single one of us, everybody, we have our own life and our own story, but we also have our function within the system, so to speak. And so when you can see people in terms of their role and how that role is being defined for them, not just how they're defining it, they're both there, then you can depersonalize it. So the things like we were hearing yesterday, the stories, when you do an action on somebody in authority, and Mark is really a meditation of authority. I'll say more about that in a minute, or power. When you do an action on somebody in authority and they say things like, well, you hurt my feelings, what they're doing is they're trying to personalize something that actually is structural, right, to actually leverage your guilt or whatever it is. So it really helps, I think, to see things in a non-personal way, even though organizing is predicated on deep personal relationships. So it's a kind of a paradox there. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. So the text we're going to look at today, the first one is Mark 3:20 to 35. I'll read it quickly and then just say a few things to set up your conversation. But again, in terms of framing it from a structural standpoint. So it says, and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, he's gone out of his mind. The Greek text says he's beside himself. He's crazy. And the scribes came down from Jerusalem and said, he has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he cast out demons. And he called them to him, and he spoke to them in parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, the house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly I tell you, people will be forgiven their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, he has an unclean spirit. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they said to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking around at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Conspicuous absence of father there, which is interesting. So the first thing to say is that the setting of this is Jesus has done healings and exorcisms up to this point in Mark. And you remember the passage in Mark 2 where they say, what is this, a new teaching? He teaches with authority. So the whole question is about authority there. It's important to notice that the crowd is really an important character in Mark. The source of Jesus' authority is the crowd. That is, I mean, it comes from his authority comes from God. But the reason the authorities are concerned with him is because he has a following. That's really important. I mean, that's even important in terms of when he gets to Jerusalem, right? I mean, the people, the only reason the Romans care about him, and the reason the scribes from Jerusalem care about him, is that he's got momentum, he's got a following, he's got people gathered around him, and that's a concern for them because it's a disturbance to the status quo. We're not going to speculate on this, but it's an interesting question to ask. Why are people saying he's out of his mind, right? What is he doing? What is he doing? Well, he's saying things that this is why I think he tells people to be quiet, is that he's saying things that are really causing a stir. They're stirring people up. And the only thing the Romans care about, by the way, is order. That's what the Pax Romana is. So there's that. But this text is basically about the scribes from Jerusalem who want to discredit him, right? They realize, so they actually now acknowledge that he has authority, and they want to say his authority comes from, not from God, which is where they claim their authority comes from, but from the devil, from Beelzebub. So a word about scribes, these scribes from Jerusalem. So the high priest in Jerusalem, and the high priest is appointed by Rome. Okay, so this is, I told you this is the role thing again, right? This is the system thing. The high priest is a functionary of Rome. Then you have the Jerusalem priestly aristocracy who mediate the empire. These scribes come from Jerusalem. They are what some people refer to as a retainer class. We have them in our own society. They're the people who mediate between the bureaucracy and the hoi polloi and the people, right? So an analogy in our context would be attorneys, right? So all of us know attorneys. It's not that these are not necessarily bad guys. These are probably faithful Jews who their job is to interpret the Torah as law for everybody. They represent Jerusalem. They represent sort of a bureaucratic authority, if you will, which is different than the authority Jesus has, which is the authority to heal and to teach and to restore life. In the passage right before this, when Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath, he has a debate with the Pharisees about this, and a lot of people think he's abrogating the Torah, but actually he's arguing as Jews do about the scriptures. He's arguing with them about how to interpret the Sabbath, and what he says is he asks the Pharisees, is it better to destroy life or to give life? Right? That's his hermeneutic. That's his interpretive key. That anything is life-giving. Why? Because that's the purpose of Sabbath. The purpose of Sabbath is to restore life. So that over against keeping rules, right? That's a bureaucratic authority, obeying the rules. And that's what scribes are, that's their role, is to make sure people obey the rules. Jesus, to them, is disobeying the rules, but he's disobeying it on a higher authority. That is to say, he's restoring life, if you will. So the questions here, this is a question, that always is in play, whether it's explicit or not, is who represents God. So the scribes represent themselves, the scribes from Jerusalem represent themselves to be God's representatives. They say they represent God's authority. The people think that Jesus represents God's authority. Again, it's the difference, if you want to think about it, between bureaucratic authority and the sort of authority that comes from acting. What's interesting is that in trying to discredit Jesus, this is really, to me, one of the important points. When they try to discredit Jesus by saying, we realize you have authority, but your authority comes from evil, right? That's what they're saying. That's the way of discrediting him. What's interesting is that Jesus does not defend himself. He will not kind of sink into that kind of defensive, personalistic defense. What he does, you'll recognize this as organizers, he does this in terms of political learning, right? The kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. This is not about me. This is about what I'm doing and its impact on the kingdom. That is to say, God's rule versus the rule of the empire. That's how he frames the issue. He reframes the issue. It's not about me and my identity. It's not about even you and your identity. You're saying that I get this authority from Satan, but if that's true, then that would divide the kingdom and it wouldn't stand. But in fact, that's not what's happening. The opposite of that's happening. The kingdom is coming, so to speak. What's the third thing here? So the idea here is that he confronts the domain of Satan. That's how he reframes it politically. Jesus confronts the domain of Satan, which is a way of referring to structural evil. That's what when we talk about Satan, it is a symbolic way of talking about structural evil. That is to say, the physical, psychological, and spiritual harm that certain groups of people experience as a result of the unequal distribution of power and privilege. That's what we're talking about. So it's even helpful to depersonalize. The idea of Beelzebub or Satan is a way of kind of personalizing, or what do you call it, anthropomorphizing evil, right? But what it's referring to is structural evil. The fact that people, it's a way of talking about. They don't use the language of structural evil. They use this kind of cosmic. It's a way of saying there are cosmic powers at work that are causing psychological, physical harm to people. But it really masks, if you will, or mystifies an unequal distribution of power. So, in this text, these are some observations. Jesus' actions speak for themselves. Again, he doesn't defend himself. He doesn't argue with them. He says, "How can Satan cast out Satan?" This is the quote from Mark 3 before. Is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? Whatever lames bodies, poisons minds, and robs people of dignity is satanic. That's how I would understand even the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. If the Holy Spirit is at work restoring life and you call that evil, that's blasphemy, right? And then the key core lesson here is that God is unconditionally committed to human welfare in the mission of Jesus. The last piece about the family, which we'll talk a little more about, I'm a little over time here, but this before the questions. In terms of, so Jesus' family is upset with him, right? This is kind of interesting. So in terms of conventional allegiances, that is to family and kin, Jesus appears crazy. I mean, this is, some of us have experienced this, right? This idea that if you're going to do this work, people go, why are you doing this? Why don't you do something conventional with your life and, make money or whatever it is? But this is what he says. This is a really important theme in Mark. I said, "Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." For Jesus, relationship is determined by practice. It's determined by what you do, by how you, this is what loving God and neighbor means. You love God by loving your neighbor, and love is a behavior. It's not a sentiment. It's a behavior. And companionship consists of shared commitment to the cause of God. That's what this passage is about. So these are the questions for discussion. What claims do people make to discredit the justice work of your organization or congregation? How do you respond to those who discredit you for acting on your faith to work for justice? And there's a lot of that. I mean, I find this all the time in my own context. People say that's not the gospel. And then the third question is, Jesus says that whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. What new family members have you found through your justice work? That's an interesting question. This is in Mark, it's interesting that oftentimes it's the outsider who's the insider, and the insiders don't quite get what Jesus is doing, right? It's the people on the margins whom he heals and encounters that somehow get all this, and it's sort of an extension, if you will, of the kinship of God.
Well, there's obviously been a lot of rich discussion this morning, as there was yesterday. I'd like to call on, from table 35, Ronnie Clark to give a brief report. And again, these reports are about like 1 minute. I know it's almost impossible to do so, but limit yourself to 1 minute to report about what went on at your table. So, Reverend Clark.
What went on at our table was that one of the ways they tried to discredit us is by calling us troublemakers. We had that issue with, we was dealing with a youth arrest problem in our community, and we was arresting more people than anyone in the state, and we were getting ready to have an action, and the official called the pastor of the church we were going to have the action and told about a week and a half out not to allow us to hold the action because we were too radical, we were troublemakers, and we were not allowed to hold the action, so we had to find another venue to go to. So they tried to discredit us and said that we are too radical, that we are troublemakers. And the other things, how do we confront them? And I gave a message that even among some of my African-American brothers, how do we deal with those who try to discredit us? Sometimes we parse the work of the kingdom, like Will says, social justice, so people can pick and choose whether to do social justice or that's not part of the gospel. We're dealing with the spiritual things. And my way of turning that is that there is no social gospel. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so when we put titles on things, we give people opportunity to discredit it and choose and pick and choose what they want to use. Then we talk about how do we have new family members. I said that one of the most enriching things about this organization and the work that we've done is for me to be able to build a relationship with people who come from different backgrounds. One of them said, the rabbi said, dealing with Christians, Catholics, even Muslim brothers and others that you deal with who have a common cause. The bishop said that, talked about the military. The military can come together and they have the cohesiveness, those who fought wars together and they share intimate things. And I said, wouldn't it be a marvelous thing if those who come together just for the act of making war and defending the Constitution, that the church could come together for the same thing, defending the faith and extending the kingdom of God.
Thank you, Pastor Clark. Yeah, amen. From table 17, Reverend Kerry Grady.
Good afternoon. Well, good morning, everyone. So our table, we talked about how this text and the other text really reminds us that the work before us is going to be very costly, that we will be criticized, questioned, and called everything but a child of God. We also said this phrase, that mission determines our family. It's also ironic that in the book of James, Jesus' own brother didn't recognize who Jesus was. And so that's also our litmus test, that the persons who are closest to us, even flesh and blood, which says in the text at the end, whoever is living on purpose and has a mission about justice will be our brothers and our sisters. I just want to share one thing that happened this past Monday in Columbia, South Carolina. We were meeting with the sheriff, and we were talking about stops of persons who have behavioral health issues. And the sheriff said to me, well, we had an issue the other day where we had a person who had behavioral health issues who threatened to kill me. And he said, now, if the person, he said, I was able to restrain them because I had help. But if the person was you, I would have had to shoot and kill them. And so I thought about that as a shot. Those are the type of things that we have to deal with on a daily basis as we seek justice in our communities. To God be the glory.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you for that story. And finally, from table 18, Pastor Bruce Havens.
The first question, we had a number of people who talked about how in public confrontations we're called disrespectful. They say when we achieve something, it was going to happen anyway. We just, we muddied the waters. Or they say that we're just sad, angry people working out our issues on public officials. I shared a story when we were confronting the previous state's attorney over civil citations. There was a pastor who was self-ordained, who wasn't even out of Jacksonville. He was out of Georgia. He would come to Jacksonville and had some money-making ministries in Jacksonville. He was able to get, after one of the bigger confrontations, he got TV time where he was able to apologize to the state's attorney for our behavior, that we weren't being Christian and that Jesus would surely rebuke us. And the upshot of that is about a year or so later, he was arrested, charges of child molestation, but never mind. How do you respond to those who discredit you for acting on your faith, to work for justice? We talked about, that can feel lonely, that we can feel very personally attacked, and appreciated the reframing of that to understand that this is a way to respond is to look at it from a systemic point of view rather than personal. And that oftentimes we can be attacked and discredited from more directions than one. They can kind of come at us from a variety of ways. And then we commented in the third one about whoever does the will of God is my brother, sister, and mother. We again commented that this work has allowed us to make connections with those from such different backgrounds that it has broadened our understanding of our ministries, of our faith, and certainly it has, I know in my personal experience, has helped me to be a better pastor and to be a better Christian. So I know I make connections through this with people I would never have in any other venue, a connectional chance to get to know and hear their experiences and really understand the injustice that those people in my community face that I don't face.
Thank you very much. It sounds like there were a lot of common conversations around the table about all three of those. One of the things that jumps out at me that Pastor Havens just mentioned, or at least I sort of alluded or got from his allusion, and that is that, again, we have to admit and confess sometimes we're ambivalent and uncomfortable when we get attacked, and to admit that and to understand that. In a room like this, it's very easy to be, pretty on fire about this work. When we get back and get confronted by people in our congregations, we have to understand our own sense of who we are. It's been my experience, and this is an oversimplification, there are basically two ways that one can respond to that second question. One is to interpret the work biblically and theologically. This is why we do it. We're not just a bunch of liberal Democrats out there. We've got some biblical basis for what we do. We've got some theological understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, hence these Bible studies, etc. It's not just us, as somebody said, working out our own ideology, our own theological understandings, or our own insecurities. No, we're trying to be as faithful as we can to what God is about in this world, so we can either theologically and biblically interpret for our people. The other extreme is to retreat and say, yeah, I guess you're probably right, so maybe community organizing is not your thing, so go find your thing, and that'll be okay. I think that's in some ways a retreat, because it's not attempting to interpret. It's not attempting to make some sense of what we're doing. And again, as a Christian minister, I said all the time, look, if you don't like what we're doing, take it up with Jesus. Dart didn't make this business up. Jesus and the prophets before him made this stuff up. So take it up with Jesus. We're just trying to be faithful to what God is about in the world and not inventing some new thing. It's about conflict, it's about tension, and all of those things. We got to work that out in our own lives, but work that out in our congregational life as well. Okay? I think we're ready for our next.
Okay, yeah. So this is the last text, and we'll look at this through a structural lens. I'm just going to do a little reframing of this, but I think this will lead to a lively discussion. So this is the story of the Syrophoenician woman, which you know well, but I'll read it, and the story of the deaf man who Jesus heals. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre, also Gentile territory, and went by the way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him, and he took him aside in private away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ear, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he groaned and said to him, Epaphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were open, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So this story of the Syrophoenician woman in particular is an interesting one because it actually casts Jesus in a very negative light. And I think this is going to be hard for us, but this is really important. This is where you actually need a structural lens to look at this, because the truth of the matter is, if we're going to take seriously that Jesus is one of us, and that he grew up in Galilee, then that means he grew up with a prejudice against Gentiles, and probably a prejudice against rich people, and probably a prejudice against cities, right? I mean, in other words, this is the way it works. You know, all these we know all this research, all these studies about children who are raised when they're little kids. They don't differentiate between people of color, or, you know, all these things. These are all learned prejudices, and we all learn them. You know, there's all this work being done now on implicit bias. So even ostensibly progressive people who want to claim they're not racist or don't have prejudices, we all have them. I mean, our unconscious works a lot faster than our conscious, and these things are always in play. So it's really important to think about kind of the structural aspects of racism, classism, sexism, all those things, right? I mean, this is about depersonalizing it. And I want to suggest to you that, I mean, the stories we've heard just in the last day and a half of people being profiled, we just heard one, they're just staggering. I mean, they're offensive, they make us angry, and yet at some level we have to think about how to depersonalize those and think deeply about the structures of that. I mean, the stuff we're seeing with sexual abuse is not just about individuals misusing their sexual abuse is about power, right? I mean, it's not just about the individual misuse of power. It's about how whole systems cover that up, right? And so you see what I'm saying? So this is the whole lens here. Now, what's amazing about this story and the way that it's told is that the protagonist or the hero in this story is this woman, right? She is the exemplar, if you will, of what it means to be faithful. And she is a tiger mom is what she is, right? I mean, that's what she is. It's like her daughter is sick, and she is not going to take no for an answer. I mean, you understand that when Jesus says, you know, what does he say? It's not right to take the children's food and throw it to the dog. That dogs is an epithet for Gentiles. I mean, it's a racial slur, right? He's learned that. So what this story is, the way I understand this story, this is a story about the conversion or transformation of Jesus, right? This is about his own growth as a human being who's doing God's work with his own people and discovers through the chutzpah of a woman that discovers through the chutzpah of this Gentile woman that God has something bigger in mind than just the village of Galilee and the surrounding villages, right? That this is for everybody. This is for everybody. You just had that conversation, you know, around how our bonds as human beings are extended when we do this work together, you know, in terms of ecumenical, interfaith, and even no faith, right? The bonds are formed around doing this work because it's about our common humanity. It's not about a belief system. And this is what this is about. So Jesus discovers the humanity of this woman who basically, you know, he dismisses initially, anyhow. So, I mean, I know this is hard to hear sometimes for people. We have Jesus on a pedestal, but again, it may help if we actually see him more in terms of our own experience and our own prejudice and see how that can change, right? How that can change. So, although Mark does not use the word in this text, there are many instances where Jesus heals somebody and he says, your faith has saved you, or your faith has made you whole, right? And we tend to think about faith as your belief, but that's not what that word means. The word in Greek is pistis, and this, I put up here a definition. This is really, I mean, people who read Greek actually know this, and it gets mistranslated, but there's a woman, she's actually a classical scholar at Oxford, Teresa Morgan, who's written this. I didn't read the whole book, but it's a 600-some page book called Roman Faith and Christian Faith. And she looks at all the uses of the term pistis, faith, in Greco-Roman literature, and then compares it to how it's used in the New Testament. This is what she says. She says basically that she maintains that it's first and foremost neither a body of beliefs, that is to say faith, is neither a body of beliefs nor a function of heart and mind, but a relationship that creates community. That's what it means in the ancient world. She concludes that authors surveyed are little interested in the interior aspects of faith, such as emotion or cognition. Although not denying these aspects, she emphasizes that faith is a quality that must be practiced in the social realm. This is what you all just been talking about the last, it's a quality or a virtue that must be practiced in the social realm and therefore is inherently relational and characteristically expressed in action towards other human beings. This woman expresses faith towards Jesus, even though he's not really prepared to, it changes him, right? And that's what faith does. So the last thing, just a couple words about the deaf man. When I hear stories like this, I think they're highly symbolic. That is to say, it's not just about the healing of one person. It's about what it means to be deaf and not be able to hear other people, and what it means to be mute and not be able to speak, right? So the text says, looking up to heaven, he groaned. I love the fact that he groaned. I was going to tell you yesterday that the word in Mark that occurs a lot, which is it's actually, unfortunately, it's translated as pity. It's the word we know as compassion. That word splagnatomai is actually about your gut, and it actually, when you get stirred, let's say around like I just did around the racial profiling story, that feeling you get in your stomach, that's kind of a cross between anger and just empathy. That's compassion, and it's what moves you. And this is a similar thing. So it says, immediately his ears were open, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly, having ears that makes true speaking possible. And so again, both these people are outsiders, and you talked about this in the last session. The good news is not confined to those who regard themselves as insiders, and faith is not just about being an insider. So these are the discussion questions. I frame this a little bit around race because to me it's such a pressing issue. But you can look at sexism, classism, all kinds of things around this issue or this text. So the discussion questions are, who are the people in your community who are treated like dogs? What do they have in common with the Syrophoenician woman? The text says, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. What does that mean in your context, to say that Jesus has done everything well? And what does that mean for you in your context? And then last but not least, Jesus disregards borders and overcomes prejudice with the help of other people. And that's always the case, right? We don't overcome prejudice by ourselves. It's other people who challenge us or agitate us that do that. So he disregards borders and overcomes prejudice. What can we learn from this story? That may be the big question for us. What can we learn from this story?
First table we want to hear from is table 13, Brother Ed Bergeron. So, Brother Ed.
Who are the Syrophoenician women in our community? The homeless, the mentally ill, the persons we are conditioned to see as roaches, which was an interesting comment, but it's based on a Netflix program, that we're conditioned to see people other than who they really are. The incarcerated, they can't vote, they can't find work, they can't be fully human any longer. We've defined that. The fact that he did works. Cajun recently got the Harvey Gantt Award, first time it's been given to an organization. And it's been a hard slog getting there, but the thing that buoys me up about that is it's the works. It's the doing of the ministry. The proof is in the pudding. The proof is By their works you shall know them. Our job as agents is to reach out and to touch and to listen to others. We are agents of persons coming to hear and regaining their voice. Our congregations, unfortunately, are the deaf
Okay.
and the dumb, and we need to talk to them. As we confess going up to the altar, we have heard the cry of the poor and the needy. Have we really? And the final question is just about the building of relationships and breaking down our own borders and fences as we get to understand our common humanity.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Good. Table 15, Reverend Charles Hayward.
This first question, we first had to re-ask the question. Who are the people in your community who are treated like less than a dog because of our humane society today, the love we place in our animals and our pets, to dehumanize human beings? I didn't share with this group. I'll add to it. I've been called ape and monkey, being dehumanized, much more than being called. I think I can't ever be being called a dog, but okay. We recognize, and so we wanted to honor the text by acknowledging that if you use this as a metaphor, then the answer to the question becomes undocumented workers, hospital workers, blacks, brown people, immigrants. To the second question, what does this mean in our context? We said that in every context of life, Jesus was open to all, and thus an encounter with Jesus prepares us to encounter others. It's our ministry to encourage, to be inclusive, and to have others participating. And what can we learn from this story? The whole matter of faith. Faith helps us to overcome our differences, helps us to overcome our religious differences, economic, racial, certainly political, and all of the hurts and the pains of life realities is on whatever side of the border you will find yourself. So if you have the spirit of faith in you, then you can be a healer.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, all of the... And one more. Table 24, Father John DeMello.
I am not a priest. I'm Floyd Edwards. We've talked about some of the same issues that you did, some of the same presentation. We recognize that we all have prejudices, but through our commonness, we can unite and recognize the difference and use that difference to build common ground. We also talked about the death and the person that was moot. Our research must be thorough and complete. That's the hearing part. And then after receiving the research and doing the research and gathering information, then we're able to speak truth to power. The last thing, as I said, we're all in need of recognizing that the poor, those without power, without prestige, without the ability to defend themselves, those are the ones in our communities that are treated like dogs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. A couple of commonalities here that I heard, and there's several, I'm sure, is the notion of our people of faith being those whose ears need to be unstopped so that they can speak. That's an important insight, it seems to me. It also occurs to me in this text, and it piggybacks on what Dr. Pickett was saying with regard to the conversion of Jesus in this text, which may be to some of us a new thought, a new way of hearing this text, that Jesus has something to learn. It really occurs to me that in this text, Jesus is not only the giver of healing, for instance, but also is the recipient. This woman provides for him a deeper understanding of prejudice, not just an intellectual kind of thing, but really puts a face on this for Jesus. And that's a powerful thing, and it gives me encouragement to be in solidarity with a Jesus who is still learning to this very day, perhaps. So these are great discussions, by the way, and thank you so much. I want to turn it back over to Dr. Pickett, who has some final summary, not just of perhaps this text, but all of, to give us a foundation of what we've been about over the last 2 days.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'm not going to try to bring closure to this, just a few thoughts to leave with. First of all, I want to remind you that all these texts will be coming up in the lectionary. And so you can think about them. And basically the work we've been doing is just a reframing. I mean, how you interpret them in your context will look different even than the way you've talked about them today, but it's a way of thinking about them kind of through this lens from the margins, if you will. And then tomorrow, there will be some sermons that'll kind of try to model this for you, but everybody's different, everybody's context is different. So it's the work of imagination, and I think imagination is actually the work of the Spirit. So one way to think about the reframing, just another way of saying what we've been doing, we were talking about the structural lens, but I mean, in a sense, one way to think about the whole of Mark is Jesus, Galilee itself is a marginal place, right? It's a backwater in Judea. And one way of seeing what Jesus does, this is sort of spatial or geographical, is he operates in the margins, and then he takes the margins to the center when he goes to Jerusalem, right? That is the center of power, if you will. So this issue of power is actually the most challenging for most of us, and it's the most challenging for the church because we have very unhealthy models and understandings of power, and we're taught to be humble and kind of just, I think sometimes we're conditioned to be passive. And so what all of us learn in this work is how to be powerful in a way that's different than the kind of all the bad examples or perversions of power we see, which makes us shrink back from that, right? So the one thing I put up here is the second bullet there. I think it's important to remind you that we're always, that the Gospel of Mark, the whole plot of the story is driven by conflict. A conflict between two different very views of the world. You can call it the world as it is versus the world as God intends it. You can call it whatever you want, but conflict is inevitable. I mean, we can't avoid conflict. And in many respects, folks, I mean, in my view, I was thinking about this when I was hearing the conversation around Mark 3, I heard some really interesting conversations about how doing this work together creates a deeper kinship with people of other faiths and even people of no faith than does sort of ecumenical dialogue and other kinds of things, because it binds us together around our common humanity. One of the things I feel strongly about, and I say this sometimes, is that there are structural reasons for the decline of the church, and there's an anti-institutional bias and all that. But in terms of what we're responsible for, it is a lack of public witness, right? And this is the sort of, it's this kind of witness, this sort of powerful relational way of acting on our faith together. It's the difference between the idea of power as a possession, that's something that I'm powerful, versus our power together, right? This relational understanding. It's the difference between those are the different models of power there. So I was talking to, and I know many examples of this. Andy Oliver who's here. Andy, I don't remember exactly where you are, but yeah, there he is. Andy, I know Andy because of a colleague at Garrett. He's in the D-Min program and organizing there, and Angela Kauser and I work together. But Andy has opened up his church to, and there are a lot of stories like this, but I'm just sharing this because I know this story, opened up his church to all these sort of justice organizations in the community, and it's turned the church inside out. So he's got all kinds of people, even people of no faith and little faith, like interested because of this work in the community, of building the community, right? That's what justice is about. It's a relational term. Justice it's a covenantal term. It means being rightly related to each other as human beings, which is what rightly relates us to God. Okay, so that's really all this is about. You don't even have to use the word justice. I mean, that's what it means. And so the question for us in reading from the margins is I think that we have to ask ourselves, and I have to ask myself this, is what's at stake for us? I mean, look at me, folks. I mean, I am a straight white male, and you could even add old to that now. So I mean, I'm like a poster boy for privilege, right? This past Monday, a few weeks ago, I've been meeting bishops in this new region that I am out west, and I had a few weeks ago, one of the bishops up in Seattle said, "Can me and the bishop from Oregon come down to Berkeley and spend the day talking together, just as three old white males, about male privilege and power?" And this past Monday, that's what we did. We spent the whole day doing that, because unless those of us who are, and did we earn that? Of course not. Right? I mean, I'm not to say I didn't work hard, but I mean, it's the question of what does someone like me do? What's at stake for someone like me, right? And the issue there is that unless somehow I maintain my connection to the margins, that affects my whole spiritual well-being, right? I mean, there is something at stake for me, unless we can see that. And so the importance of, this is why I like coming to these things. I mean, I try to do it in my own context, but we have to be connected to people's real lives. When I was talking to Andy yesterday, he reminded me, and I'd forgotten about this, but Angela Kauser, who was an organizer for 20 years and now teaches at Garrett, who's actually moving to Louisville, Andy was reminding me that she does this with Andy, with others. This is her agitation, is that talks about the calendar as a moral document, and she tells people she says, go when you read the Gospels, look at how Jesus spends his time, and then look at how you spend your time, and what's the difference between those two things, right? So that changes everything. So I think the last thing I want to say, I had another conversation a couple, 2-3 weeks ago with John Powell. I was telling John about this. John knows this person. I had just read his book called Racing Toward Justice, and John Powell is he's one of the, you should read the book. He's one of the leading people in this country on race. He's an African American who teaches in the law school at University of California, Berkeley, but he also directs the Haas Institute for a Fair, Inclusive Society. And it's interesting. I don't know if John Powell is a person of faith. I wanted to talk to him about race and about organizing, because the reason I went to talk to him is because all the organizers in the Bay Area talk about him and they all know him. So I went to talk to him, and I wanted to talk to him about organizing and race. He wanted to talk to me about religion, which I thought was very interesting. But I had been reading his book, but I wasn't quite done. And the next to last chapter of his book is called Lessons from Suffering, and it's about spirituality and justice. That's the subtitle of it. Now, this is a person, again, I don't know, he's not overtly religious, but this is a person working on race, talking about the connection between spirituality and justice. And this is what he said. I've been thinking about this for a couple weeks now, because I just read it, I just finished it. He says basically there are two kinds of suffering. There's ontological suffering, the suffering of our being. And the suffering of our being is caused mostly by separation and isolation. So what he says, and I think this is right, I think you'll resonate with this, most spiritual seeking is rooted in suffering, and for people of privilege, it's rooted in this sort of disconnection from other people. And what's ironic about that is that the trend in our country for a long time now, because that word spirituality means so many different things, but most people are trying to fill that void by a kind of self-transcendence, which just turns them back in on themselves. Right? That's what's going on. That's the zeitgeist. Social suffering is what we've been talking about for the last couple days, right? Social suffering is structural evil. It is the suffering caused by the ideology of domination. You know, the market God. I mean, the market God's driving all this. That God is real and is driving all this sort of oppression because people's hunger for it. In other words, they fill that lack with a desire for the god of money, or the cult of money was heard earlier. And so, I mean, the whole argument of the book is that racism, and we can add all kinds of other problems that all of us are dealing with, is the disconnection between the suffering of our own being and social suffering. And the work of organizing is actually connecting to that social suffering in a way that redeems our humanity. So the work that you're doing is not only important from that standpoint, but it's important in terms of the witness. It's important to frame this work this way so that people understand that what people are looking for, I really do believe this, people are looking, the only way out of this kind of morass of being turned in on yourself, this sort of ontological suffering, is to find yourself to be a part of a story larger than yourself, and to find yourself to be a part of a community that's larger than yourself. And I think that's what people are hungry for, and the church has not done a very good job. You know, I read most of you read this horrible story of Larry Nassar and the abuse of all these young women. You know, I forgot her name, but the girl, the young woman who first disclosed this, said that the church is the worst place to go to talk about this, right? That's on us. Yeah, so we have work to do both in the community and in the church. And you know, the thing that Powell says that I've been carrying with me, it's been kind of it's been my new lens for the last month or so, is he talks about racism as a profoundly spiritual project. A profoundly spiritual project. And he says that the only remedy for that is what he calls bridging and belonging. Creating spaces, you know, ways to bridge across these chasms between the margins and the center, between people of color, between rich and poor, you know, all of whom share a common humanity, and then create spaces of belonging. And I think, you know, the organizing work is what takes us out into the community, but then we have to figure out, as people of God in communities of faith, how to create space to expand that space so that people can belong. Not because they share our belief, our ideology, but because they're children of God, really. It really comes down to that. I think that's all I got.
We are very blessed to have 4 individuals who work among us For local youth arrests, Reverend Ronnie Clark from Peace in Polk County will share statewide youth arrests. Monsignor Chanel Chante from PACT in Miami. Jail expansion, Reverend Ted Mosher from Justice Matters in Lawrence, Kansas. And crime and violence, Father John List from Lexington, Kentucky and BUILD. So we invite them to give their presentations at this time.
My name is Ronnie Clark, and I serve as the pastor of the Hearst Chapel AME Church, Winter Haven, Florida. I'm also a member of Peace Polk County. When peace shows up, our justice ministry surfaced the experience of people living in the margins. Because of our justice ministry and our listening process, I learned that a child in my congregation was arrested at the age of 10 years old because he threw a paper cup at a moving car. That 10-year-old child was handcuffed, brought into police custody, and was criminalized for childish behavior. I learned that another child in my congregation was arrested at the age of 12 because they were walking through an orange grove to get home faster from school. This 12-year-old child was handcuffed, brought into police custody, and was criminalized for taking a shortcut home. I was in disbelief and feeling righteous anger and indignation. We soon learned that these cases were not isolated cases, that there were literally 1,000 children every year who had been arrested for the first time on non-serious offenses who didn't need to be arrested and were suffering years down the road from these arrest records. We had the highest rate of youth arrests in the state. There were proven solutions to address these problems, but nothing was being done. When we met with our sheriff, Ray Judge, the bastion of Christianity in our community, he told us I can arrest whoever I want, and that he thought it was therapeutic to put young people in handcuffs and put them in the back of the car and drive them down to the Jack Center. We had the highest arrest rate in the state, and our sheriff was telling us it was therapeutic. We knew that God was calling us to stand in the gap for our children who were being unnecessarily punished. We believe in the story of forgiveness, that every child in Polk County deserved to be children, acting like children, and not treated as a price point for the jail and prison system. For 6 years, we were like persistent widows in Luke 18, 1-8, who kept coming to our sheriff and state attorney with a plea, grant us justice. And like the persistent widow who was at first refused, they finally had to say, yet because peace keep bothering us, I will see that they get justice. At our last Nehemiah action, in front of 1,200 people, our sheriff and state attorney said yes to diverting children at the Juvenile Assessment Center. For the first time in the history of Polk County, because of our justice ministry, from June through November of last year, our county went from averaging 0 diversions at the Juvenile Assessment Center to an average diversion rate of 70%. That is 361 children whose innocence will be kept intact and will not be impacted by an arrest record for the rest of their lives. Because peace showed up, and
good morning. I'm Monsignor Chanel Gentil, and I am currently serving as president of PACT and also a pastor at St. James Catholic Church in North Miami, predominantly a Haitian American parish. And I also serve as assistant to the Archbishop Winsky, who is here sitting on my left, along with serving as chancellor and vicar general of the Archdiocese of Miami. Yeah. So when I got involved with this work, it's not because I was looking for one more thing to do, another hat to wear. But the reason why I got involved first, back in 7 years ago, my brother was arrested. And he was, that's a little bit more than 7 years ago, actually, as I'm thinking about it now. He was 17 at the time. He was hanging around with the wrong crowd. One of them had, petty theft at a convenience store and was standing outside. The police came. He didn't even know what's going on, but he was arrested at the time and eventually put into jail and then transferred into prison. And he spent about 8 months in prison. He came to find out that he didn't commit the petty theft himself, but he was kept so that he would eventually give up whoever had done that they had not caught at the time. And eventually it took us a while. I blame my brother first for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time or hanging around with the wrong crowd. And culture being arrested, it's pretty shameful. And so at the time, I needed to kind of work that prejudice in my heart myself against my own brother, who kind of became the other, at the time. And then eventually came to find out by telling his own story and hearing him out that he didn't, commit, anything wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. And so at the time, I was pretty angry. I didn't know a way to do anything about it. And then eventually, as I got involved and also part of a parish ministry, a mostly African-American ministry, that came to find out there are many other stories like that in the congregation that were coming up. And that's eventually what was my motivation in being able to use that as a tool for me to be more active in making a difference, and so that I can be part of the solution so that it doesn't happen to another kid like my brother. And so I've been involved with PACT for the last 7 years myself. And now, as we are thinking about this, and in 2004, PACT joined with 9 DART sister organizations in Florida to stop youth arrests, and we call it the Criminal Justice Collaborative. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge the help of CCHG, Catholic Human Development, and a special 5-year national strategic grant for our efforts. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge them, as some of them are members are in the room. And in 2004, we find out that over 13,000 kids were arrested for minor offenses, such as playing in park after dark, stealing a keychain, throwing an orange on a bus. So, it certainly was a bit of a struggle for all of us who were in this part of this ministry to think that something so stupid can be met with, cruel punishment, such as arrest records for the rest of their lives. So why is this problems for these 13,000 children that were being arrested? All 13,000 children were eligible for a civil citation. That is, it would not show a criminal arrest record, and that law enforcement was giving only 32% of eligible children a non-arrest record. And so a criminal arrest record is a problem because it is an obstacle to scholarships, through certain occupations, to military, and all the other things that eventually, when somebody comes up with an arrest record in your past, that gives them any prejudices as to what this might have been, and can be an obstacle in all the future realizations of any children. So we decided that this had to stop, and our congregations have organized 15,000 each year for the past 4 years to come out to Nehemiah assemblies to insist our law enforcement use non-arrest civil citations. And after what has changed since then, since we went into this work in 2014, is that the state use civil citation now as increase from 32 to 58%. Now, still, this is not good enough for us, but it certainly is quite an improvement. some counties that weren't using it before are now using it, and some counties have agreements with stakeholders to increase the use of civil citations to up to 80%. Just as Miami-Dade, that we were part of as PACT, have increased their civil citations up to 96% of eligible kids who can indeed not receive an arrest record. Yes. Now, the overall state arrest of children has dropped to a 42-year low from 24% in the last 5 years to 7% last year. It's amazing. So last year, nearly 5,000 kids benefited from our efforts of the collaborative that we do together for civil citation. This is a savings to the state of up to $22 million, and that last year alone that they spent in trying to really, the prison pipeline, if you would. And so why am I involved and will continue to be? Because every one of these children, of course, is a child of God who deserves another chance. Every one of them is my brother. Every one of them is part of this way of making solidarity and maintaining that just relationship that we've just so much talked about in the past couple of days. And it is worth my time that, as part of being a pastor, that leading the way ultimately, so that there's only one answer to saying and giving kids another chance, and also not to be an obstacle to their future, to continue to be part of this work. And so let justice roll. Thank you.
My name is Ted Mosier, and I serve as a pastor at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Lawrence, Kansas, where I also serve as a co-president of our justice organization called Justice Matters. America is at a tipping point, and in a country that continues to lead the world in locking up its own people, mass incarceration has emerged as a defining issue for our time. And as people of faith, we must tell the truth about the failed punitive practices and policies surrounding our criminal justice system. We must tell the truth even when articles in the paper seem to lead because they bleed, and then they breed fear. We must tell the truth that runaway use of incarceration dehumanizes poor people and people of color, damages already marginalized communities, does not advance public safety, and siphons public resources with no social benefits. We must tell the truth that the old adage that if brute force isn't working, then you're not using enough, that is a destructive lie. And we must tell the truth that Pharaoh's basic instinct is to lie and cover up instead of telling the truth when it comes to these failures. In Lawrence, we are working to undo the failed apparatus of mass incarceration at its front door, the local jail. Most people focus on prisons when talking of mass incarceration, but jails are where it all begins. There are 12 million jail admissions a year. That's 19 times the annual admissions to state and federal prisons, and it's growing. In fact, if you have not had a bigger jail floated in your community, trust me, you will soon. If you're looking for good news, this is it. It's not your governor or your U.S. senator who determines who's in your jail. It's your local police officer, judge, prosecuting attorney, and sheriff who are quietly locking up more and more people in jail each day. But our power to move things at the local level can put a huge crimp in the system. Of course, the system doesn't identify its failures until the jails fill up. And when that happens, it coughs out the simplest answer that it can provide: more jails, bigger jails. But in Lawrence, we believe that it is at that moment where the system is at its weakest, because the quiet growth in jails creeps out of the darkness and into the light, and hat in hand, the local leaders must come to the people and ask for more money to fund a system that doesn't work and ignores the obvious. Most people are in jail because they're too poor to post bail. They have an addiction or a mental illness or an abusive relationship. And the burden of jail incarceration doesn't fall on everyone equally. It disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color. And guess what else? There's a lot of money that's being discussed. In our community, they're asking us to invest a total of $166 million over the next 20 years to double the number of people we're currently jailing. Now, we've been strongly advocating, and we're in the middle of a fight because there's a ballot initiative that's coming before us now, but we've been strongly advocating to our county commissioners to engage an alternative to jail expansion. And we have heard one of Pharaoh's favorite lines, you've heard it many times too, and that is that there is no other option. There is no other way. So it's our plan to defeat the jail expansion proposal and then work to reform our system to minimize the misuse of our jail while increasing opportunities for people to get drug and mental health treatment. In other words, to say no to a bigger jail and yes to a better way based on prevention, fairness, and real restoration. Thank you.
I'm John List with Build in Lexington, where last year there were hundreds of shootings, with the tally being 28 people dead. Now, this is the highest number of deaths by gun in a given year in the history of Lexington. And so, obviously, the problem is getting worse, not better. Just yesterday, there were 3 separate shootings, 3 teenagers killed, 3 more lives lost, all in a 6-hour period of time. Now, our public officials tell us that 28 deaths is not unreasonable for a city the size of Lexington. They say, well, actually you should probably expect something like that, a tally of 28 in a given year. Well, we've got an odd point of view. We think that each and every shooting death is a tragedy before God. And it's especially tragic when there are, in fact, tools to prevent it. Our city's response last year was to hire more police officers. That's where they want to put their money. Well, we say that's not enough. Police officers need to earn the trust of the community. They need better training and new strategies. More of the same is not going to produce a better result. Now, this is hard for our politicians and the leaders to hear. They want to talk about how great things are in Lexington, you know, and there are some great things. But I'm reminded of the words of our Holy Father, Pope Francis, who said, "We do not judge our progress based on how the wealthiest are doing. Instead, we evaluate our greatness by observing how the most vulnerable are faring. And when we see deficiencies, we are called to respond in faith." Now, people, as we've said, largely poor and people of color, are being killed in record numbers in marginalized communities across the country. And in Lexington, we want to say their lives matter just as much as those who breed horses, sell bourbon, and underwrite UK basketball. Can I get an amen to that? Now, in fact, may I offer Big Blue Nation heresy here? The witness of our faith is that reducing gun violence is more important than national championships. Now, I got to tell you, I'm angry about the growing violence in our city because, frankly, it's an affront to human dignity. I'm angry that our mayor has passed off any responsibility on this problem. Whatever my chief says, that's good enough. And speaking of our chief, he has said he doesn't want anybody to tell him what to do. He's the expert. Now, we hear, and we've all heard this, not enough money for new programs. Too long we've heard Lexington is a thriving, a great place to live. Well, they tell us at least Lexington is better off than Louisville. Sorry, Clout. That's what they tell us. It's not that bad. Scripture is clear that the lives of all our brothers and sisters are valuable, are of worth before God, the Father of us all, over us all. Through Build, we are organizing to get Lexington leaders to consult with those experts at the National Networks of Safe Communities because they have a proven track record across the nation of reducing violence and improving public safety, strengthening communities, improving relationships between law enforcement and community. We are challenging the go-along to get-along culture in Lexington. It's a tough fight, but we're in this for the long haul because there are lives at stake. So, Build, let us rise up and build. Everybody, let us rise up and build.
Thank you all. Appreciate the wonderful words that we have. And now I have the great privilege of asking Archbishop Thomas Wensky from Miami to introduce our speaker, Cardinal Turkson. Before Archbishop Wensky was assigned to Miami, he was my bishop, and so I was very pleased to be able to have worked with him for a number of years. And so we please welcome Archbishop Thomas Wensky.
Thank you. It is certainly a privilege for me to be able to introduce a churchman of the caliber of Cardinal Peter Turkson. Cardinal Peter Turkson had led up as president the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in Rome. And a few years ago, in a reorganization of those various agencies or entities that exist to help the Holy Father in his universal ministry, the Council for Justice and Peace was folded into a new entity that was called now, and he is now the prefect of the dicastery for promoting integral development. Now, I think it's easier to understand Council for Justice and Peace. And we know what a president is, but I'm not sure everybody knows what a prefect is, and I'm sure nobody knows what a dicastery might be. But it probably isn't a bad idea to make the name change, because for many years, as a archbishop or a bishop, a member of the United States Council of Catholic Bishops, I did a term as the president of International Justice and Peace, a committee of bishops that looks on these issues, and then I was president of the Domestic Justice and Peace. So each term was for 3 years. So I used to be carrying these, name tags, and it would be, Bishop Wensky, president or chairman of Justice and Peace. And I kept on getting stopped in elevators, because they'd say to me, they'd say, "Are you in charge of Justice and Peace?" And I say, "Yes." And they said, "Well, you better start doing a better job." So I can assure you that Cardinal Turkson is is doing a great job, a job that takes him out of his office in Rome throughout, to travels around the world, which is why he comes here. He was last year in Modesto, California at that meeting of grassroots organizations that the Holy Father was promoting. There was one here in the United States and one in Latin America. He was in Miami a couple years ago as part of the implementation or the rollout of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on the environment. And I was honored to host him at my home. One of the priests of Miami was a classmate of his from Ghana. And of course, we have a priest here from Volusia County, Father John Bosco, who was a student of his in Ghana when he was studying in the seminarian. Cardinal Turkson comes here to represent Pope Francis. And we know the great themes of his pontificate. He has been talking about the necessity of the church to reach out to the peripheries, to find those people that are marginalized, that are forgotten, people that are discarded or are seen or deemed to be disposable. Pope Francis has spoken much about the la cultura del descarte and about the globalization of indifference. And so we saw him shortly after becoming Pope to go to Lampedusa, where he celebrated Mass for a group of African migrants who were traveling from the northern coast of Africa seeking refuge in Europe, and many of them were shipwrecked, and he said a Mass for a group of survivors for them. We see him visiting prisons. We see him reaching out to people in pain, people that are wanting to be affirmed in their own human dignity. And we could say that this is the work of Cardinal Turkson, and that is what brings him here to Orlando today to encourage you in your own work among the peripheries, the marginalized that we have in abundance here in this country of wealth and plenty. And he comes to encourage you, but hopefully he will also enlighten you. So I am happy to present to you Cardinal Turkson. We couldn't get the Pope, but we got the Cardinal.
Thank you, Bishop. Good morning to you. I think it's still morning. All of you, my brothers and sisters, leaders of churches, members of church organizations, and members of different movements gathered here for this meeting of conference of the coming 3 days. Certainly very glad for the invitation to be here, to join you and to share in your experiences. As Archbishop Wensky just said, I think I'm learning a lot. We work in Rome, in our offices and all of that, but we recognize also that the church is really down there in the dioceses, in the parishes where God's people live. We're supposed to work in collaboration with them to support and to encourage them, but mostly we also need to learn from local churches, from what happens there, so we also know how to address issues which come to us. This morning I've been invited by the organizers of this program to address an issue just introduced by the Archbishop. Pope Francis and his ministry, especially a letter that he wrote in an apostolic exhortation called Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, in which he used an expression about a church and expressed a preference for a bruised and battered church rather than a church which is nicely well confined in offices and palaces and all. So this is what I've been invited to reflect on with you. It just means for me then that it's basically to look at Pope Francis's leadership in this regard, about the church and leadership in the church with you, by way of encouraging you in what you do. In the conclave at which Pope Francis was elected, he happened to be sitting by another Brazilian bishop, Cardinal Humas is his name, who is since retired, and on retirement decided to go to Brazil, to go to the Amazon, and do ministry in there. So as at the conclave, they were counting the votes, and it seemed to be then going towards, Bergoglio. Cardinal Humas laid his hands on his to strengthen him, to encourage him, and then whispered to him, "Do not forget the poor." And so, as happens, when every pope is elected, he's asked them to choose a name. And as Pope Francis himself had a chance to say this several times in different settings and audiences, he chose the name Francis to respond to this invitation not to forget the poor. So he chose the name Francis basically because of the great concern that he wanted to show in his pontificate for the poor. And so similarly, when he met the diplomatic staff in the Vatican, as he does at least once every year in January, he explained to the diplomats that were gathered that he chose the name Francis because the world still has millions of poor people who still need to be shown some attention, and most importantly, the love of God. So that is what lies behind this. Subsequently, the first Mass that Pope Francis celebrated in the Vatican after his election as a pope coincided with the feast of St. Joseph. And reflecting on the theme of Joseph having to care for the Holy Family, Pope Francis then went on to present the issue of exercising custody over anything that is entrusted to us. And with that, introduced the theme of care instead of custody and safeguarding or exercising any responsibility. At that time, he said that two things in this world are crying to us for attention and for care. They're the poor ones in our midst and creation or nature, which is also being abused. So two things crying to us for help, the poor in our midst and creation. And then in response to this cry, he encouraged us to use more and more the word care instead of safeguarding or any sense of responsibility, because care is more passionate, it's more from the heart, and it shows a deeper commitment. So, Pope Francis then came out with this encyclical letter, apostolic exhortation, the joy of the gospel. He says that this is the mission of the church, to proclaim and to spread the joy of the gospel. Referring to what the angels said at the birth of Jesus, when they appeared to the shepherds, "I bring to you glad tidings of great joy, which is destined." So this is Pope Francis, which is destined for all people. So according to Francis, the joy of the gospel is not destined for a few and others left out. It's a joy that is meant to be inclusive, that is meant to go to all and to all parts of the world. That is the thought behind this apostolic exhortation. So his challenge is, how does the church make the joy of the gospel get to everybody, including the poor and the type of people whose concern for whom have brought us all here together this past 3 days?
So it is getting the joy of the gospel to all in our society. So in this apostolic exhortation, Pope Francis first traces why the gospel is presented as a joyful event in scriptures, in Bible to us, and then goes on to describe this as a mission of the church. When Jesus sent out his disciples, it was that they preached this joy of the gospel to the ends of the earth. And so concern for preaching the joy of the gospel to the ends of the earth and for making it exclusive, making it inclusive for all, that becomes a big concern. And so in doing that, he talks about two things: the church institution that must make this possible, and the leaders of this institution who must also help make this possible. So Francis is talking about two things: the church as an institution that must carry the gospel to the ends of the earth, the gospel of joy, and the leaders in the church who must also make this possible. Therefore, the organizers of this event had addressed paragraph 49 of this apostolic exhortation, which I now read. Let us go forth then, and let us go forth to offer everyone the life of Jesus Christ. Here I repeat for the entire church what I have often said to the priests and the laity of Buenos Aires. I prefer a church which is bruised and hurting and dirty because it has been out there on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church concerned with being at the center and which then ends by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. If something should rightly disturb us and trouble our consciences, it is a fact that so many of our brothers and sisters are living without the strength, the light, the consolation born of friendship with Jesus, without a community of faith to support them, and without meaning and a goal in life. And so, more than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, and within habits which make us feel safe. While at our door, people are starving, and Jesus does not tire of saying to us, give them something to eat. So, this is the paragraph which identifies Pope Francis's concern for the mission of the church. His preference has been made clear. He prefers to see a church which is dirty, bruised, and battered because he's been out there working for the poor, rather than a church which is concerned about its cleanness, its security and safeness, and being shut up. And probably his own choice of where to stay in the Vatican is indicative of this. Elected Pope, he decided to live, if you want, in a hotel in the Vatican. That's what Santa Marta is. And so living in Santa Marta, the Pope certainly now become more accessible to the public than to have lived in the papal palace. The point is not the luxury of the living places, because the apartments in the Apostolic Palace are not terribly luxurious. There's a lot of space, but it's not luxury. And so the thing that is covered with the Church of Prayer is the accessibility of Francis to people. And that is a big thing he wanted to emphasize, that he is a pope of the people, to be accessible to people. So his preference has been made. He prefers a church that has been out there, busy and all. And then he goes out to add a few things which people in the Curia will probably understand probably better than people here gathered at this meeting in Orlando. For example, when he says that he prefers, if anything should disturb us, it is that so very many of our brothers are living out there. So more than fear of going astray means saying does something which is doctrinally wrong or which is disputed as not right of church doctrine or whatever type of thing, instead of fear of going on, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within ourselves. So instead of doing something wrong with the church structures and whatever, the thing which should concern us rather is the fact that the church is not reaching out to this. And as you know, certainly reading emails and everything, you know probably where the Pope is coming from. Some say he is destroying the church. Some say he's not keeping the doctrines. Some say he's not, the thing about marriage and all of that. When Pope Francis talks about his preference for a bruised and battered church that needs to go out and all of that, as I said, it's not just the church as an institution that he's talking about. Most importantly, also the leaders of this institution, the pastors and all. And so before he comes to this, an earlier paragraph, 42 of the same document, had talked about the pastors needing to have two images he uses. The pastors needing to have the odor, the smell of the sheep on them. Okay, that's an image he used, that the pastors must have the odor, the smell of the sheep on them. It means they must be where the people are, share the experiences and live with them in their travel and everything that they're experiencing. And then another image that he uses is that pastors must be like field doctors. Doctors are accompanying soldiers on the battlefront, so must be out there where the action is. So these are two images that the Holy Father uses. So if the church must not think about its own safety and security, but must think rather about those who need to hear the gospel of joy, so must the leadership be out there with the people in the church as it goes out to so make the love of Jesus inclusive and reach all. With these two images then, which Pope Francis presents to us, having the smell of the sheep, the pastors having the smell on the sheep on them, this led to one of his visits to one Italian Roman parish right after that they have interestingly gotten a small lamb ready. So when he got there, they just offered him the sheep, which he gladly put on around his shoulder. So he must have the smell or the odor of the sheep on him. So this was an imagery. For Pope Francis, the experience of pastors cannot be different from the experience of the church. And on account of that, these images that I share with you, I'll probably try to conclude with, reflecting on some figure in scriptures that is very well known to all of us. So the two images then, he wants a battered church, a church that must be out there because the love of God must get to everybody. The experiences that you share in this room are basically that. The experience of very many of you representing the church that must be there with the people. And on account of that, you get bruised or you get battered and all of that, basically because that's where the church is. Early in the history of the church, that was the experience. I mean, when you read the letter of Paul to the Colossians and all, Paul talking about the Ephesians, Paul talking about his imprisonment and the fact that I bear these chains on account of you, that was Paul making the experience of being a bruised church, battered and all, but that was so that the gospel of Christ may get to the different parts of the earth. With the church getting institutional after Constantine the Great and all of that, the institutionalization of the church is probably, moved the church away from some of such experience. And the reminder then that Pope Francis brings is very, very, is very important and up to date. We must not forget how the church began. It was through imprisonment, bearing chains, and being bruised that the gospel got to the ends of the earth. And it cannot be differently done now. It must be through the same battered and bearing of chains and all of that the gospel must continue to reach the ends of the earth. And when that is the case, then the pastors must bear the smell or the odor of the sheep, and the pastors must be like people working, being field doctors, working where the church have the accompaniment that is necessary for people in that situation. So I don't exceed my time. Exploring these two images with which Pope Francis invites us to do all we can to make the experience of the love of Christ get to almost every corner of the earth. This experience will be, the experience of God's love will be felt differently by us in different situations. As we sat on our scripture table looking at whatever, the experiences were said. Somebody has said this morning that a sheriff had warned me, for whatever, I shoot you. Somebody said, all the experiences you're sharing are attempts to get the love of Christ revealed to very many others in our society, and that's not the end. There's still a lot that we need to do. But how do we do it? How do we do it? Francis, in this small literature, gives a lot of tips about how we can go about doing this. But I'd like to share one image with which to conclude all of this, given that I have about 20 minutes or 25 minutes to do this. One imagery with which I think I can conclude this with is the imagery of the figure of Moses. Moses, as you know, also set out wanting to bring liberation to people. In the book of Exodus, Moses' first move was that, to bring liberation to his people, the oppressed people of Israel, and that led to the killing of the Egyptian officer, and he attempting to bury him in the sand. That was an attempt of Moses to bring liberation to God's people. But as we also all know, that move of Moses failed. It failed because it didn't get the recognition of the people he was trying to help himself. The next time he went there, they shoved him aside and, who has made you a judge over us? So with that, Moses realized that something was wrong. And this is Moses, who has spent 40 years in the palace of Pharaoh and been trained in all the sciences and all the knowledge of that time, of Egypt of those days. So it's Moses stepping out full of knowledge, full of all the skills and all, to offer help to his people. But is it possible that the knowledge that we acquire also make us lose real sight of the situations? So Moses' first effort led to a failure. And as a result of that, he himself ran, as you know, into the Midian desert, trying to now get, concerned about his own life. The big projects about saving his people from slavery, all of that was forgotten. Moses was now concerned about his own safety. Until again, God broke into his life at the burning bush, where, according to Stephen in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 7, where the life of Moses is arranged in a series of 40 years. So at this time, at the end of his stay in Midian desert, Moses was now about 80. And then he sees a bush burning, but not consumed. And at 80, still having the interest enough to want to say, let me go and find out what is happening. That capacity to be excited about situation and conditions of people is very crucial. And so at 80, Moses climbs a cliff to go find out why the bush was on fire, but not burning or being consumed. And it is there that he met the God of the people he was trying to help. And if you happen to look at that passage again, recommended, this is Exodus chapter 3. When you read that passage, see and count how many times God uses the first person reference. I have heard my people's cry. I have seen the affliction. I know what they're going through. So everything is God. It's almost God wanting to tell Moses that if anybody must help that people, it must be me. I must be the one to take the lead. I must be the one to make the first move. The people you're trying to help are not your people. They're my people. I know what they're going through. I know everything that is happening to them. And so then God said, come, I will send you. That's when the ministry of Moses begins to be successful. And I cite this passage because we gathered here as leaders. Leaders of a church that needs to be bruised and battered to get God's message and God's love to the ends of the earth. And how do we exercise that leadership? To precisely make our communities take the love of God, the message of God to the ends of the earth. Moses has a lot to teach us. It just means that sometimes in going about this, Our own knowledge and professional expertise can sometimes also make us not see the truth about the people we're trying to help. And it is important that we see the truth about the people we're trying to help. And most important because, first and foremost, they're people of God. And because they're people of God, God must take the priority in the move and everything that we do to want to help them. So the lesson of Moses teaches us that. And then God sends Moses, and he sends Moses to identify and to be part of that people. Now to share in the slave condition that the people were in, and told with them to go to Pharaoh together and to ask to be set free. Moses now is not somebody that comes down from the court of Pharaoh with his expertise and all of that to try to help people in the day. Moses is now part of the people. He begins, in the words of Pope Francis, to have the order of the sheep on him. He begins now to also to be a field doctor, to be able to help the people. So Moses, who leads the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt, is Moses who's now become part of God's people, and now recognizes that the people are not really his, to be determined by his own scheme of things. But first and foremost, they're the people of God. And so to deal with them, he must seek God's own will for his people. And this is crucial for us as leaders in this ministry. We must recognize at a certain point that the people we trying to help are first and foremost God's people. And in the different situations in which they find themselves are situations which are known to God. And so it is like asking God to make us instruments of whatever measures we seek to adopt. And when God adopts us as instruments of salvation for his people, instruments for the proclamation of his love, we're successful. When we do it ourselves in a way that can be discordant with God's own plan, there can be failures. There can be despair. And sometimes we tend to give up. But let God use us. Let God become the author of, make us instruments of his own concern and love for God's people. It just means that serving God's people in the different communities and movements in which we belong in. Of course, I recognize that not everybody is a Catholic or whatever. I mean, Christians and non-Christians and all of that gathered here. But it's good to recognize every now and then that the people we seek to work with are first and foremost God's people. And in any situation in which they find themselves and we seek to help, it's good if we help as God's instrument or instruments of God's people. That just means that we should first and foremost seek and endeavor to discern God's will for his people, and then become implementers of this will of God for his people. That way we never get discouraged, we never get despaired, and we never get, as it were, have a burnt-out feeling, because God sustains us and he makes us successful in the moves and all what we have to do. So this is a brief message I have to share with you, given the time available to me. 3 things then that we want to consider this morning. Pope Francis himself shows us the way. He wanted to be a sign of a bruised church. So he gives us the pontifical or papal palace, and he lives in a hotel. So to enhance his own accessibility to the public and have a chance to meet the public almost every day. Because at Mass every day, there is a crowd. There's a group from outside. And he does not simply celebrate the Mass from them, but after the Mass, he greets each one of them and has a word with each one of them personally. An attempt, as it were, to get into the situation of everybody that he meets. So from that experience and from that desire, he then comes to then advise the pastors and the church that he himself leads. We should endeavor not to be imprisoned by concern of the structures that we serve, the laws that we make, the systems of worship that we formulate. All of them must become tools and instruments for our mediating and making the love of God reach people. And when concern for any of these structures make it difficult for us to reach out, to witness the God's love, that's already a sign that there's a problem, and we need to try to deal with it. This is Francis's message for his church and for the leaders of his church. Therefore, have the author of the sheep on you, meaning you have to share the experience of your sheep to be able to understand what they're going through and to be able to find solutions for them. In so doing, I say Moses teaches us perfectly what we need to do. He tried also to help God's people in the past, but he began with ideas that he himself had formulated, and God corrected him. God corrected him, so he tell him that the people belong to me. I know what they're going through, and I'm the one to send you if what you're going to do to save and to liberate them is going to be successful. And so in also our work as leaders of the different organizations that we represent, let us also seek the will of God, recognizing that the people belong to God. And when God uses us as instruments for the work we do, bringing them liberation, bringing them joy, bringing them peace, there is success. And when it's just ours, we can be despaired, we can lose courage, we can have even a burnt-out feeling and all of that. And we want to say this morning, all of that is not necessary for all of us gathered here. Recognizing that we carry out the love of somebody, the love of Christ for people, let Christ be the mentor. Let Christ be the one who sends us and indicates how we show this love of God in the communities that we serve. And when that is the case, as faithful apostles and disciples of the Lord, we are always happy and we rejoice in the Lord who sends us, who directs our mission, and who makes our work successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Cardinal Turkson, for an inspiring message, both from our Holy Father, as well as to allow us to know that we are doing the work of God, and that should give us that great joy. So now our panel response, we're inviting up Father Greg Hamas from Topeka Jump, Reverend Anthony White from Hope in Hillsborough County, and Reverend John Mark Wiggers from Justice Knox in Knoxville, Tennessee, who will definitely show us about the odor of the sheep that they have worked with in their, their message.
Check. Hi, I'm Father Greg Hamas, and I'm the pastor of Most Pure Heart of Mary Catholic Church in Topeka, Kansas. And we're a congregation of about 1,600 families, and we're members of Topeka Jump, our Justice Unity and Ministry project. And so glad to do that. So the word credibility comes to mind. And Dr. Pickett said, why is the church declining? We haven't given that public witness. We haven't been credible. And Pope Francis says about being a bruised and battered church. So I wanted to share one piece of credibility of myself. I know that's probably not right to show your own credibility. I'm literally bruised from this conference. Getting into a van, going out to dinner last night, I cut my knee and actually cut my pants. And I didn't even realize it till later, but I know that's not justice ministry, going out to dinner, but it's part of a justice conference. But yeah, we're supposed to be out there doing the work of ministry, being with the poor, hearing them, advocating for them, and it's messy. It's messy. You know, one way my ego has been battered, it relates a lot to what Cardinal Turkson said. I was preaching about this message of justice and how important. And then one lady afterward, who's very distinguished and a grandmother, actually our grandson is a seminarian. He's studying to be a priest. This grandmother said to me, Jesus didn't come for social justice. And she was angry about it. Jesus didn't come for social justice, and it really made me think, did I say something wrong? And but I decided, no, he did. He came for all of that. He came for our souls, but to make this world a place of love and justice and peace. So anyways, our justice ministry is building. In my church, we have this giant crucifix at the front. And everybody looks at it every Mass. They're looking at the body of Christ, and that body of Jesus on the cross it's bruised and it's battered. And we like to see that. We need to see that. But we got to not forget that the body of Christ is out there, and it's bruised and battered. And what has helped me build my justice ministry is getting people to see that. That's the biggest blessing for me. Often I'm kind of behind my walls in my institution, and I don't see. But being part of this network, I'm seeing so much. It's changing me. And I'm getting to know Topeka, Kansas, and the issues there. Affordable housing. I was in somebody's house, and it stank. And so much so, I had the smell of the sheep. When I went home, I immediately threw all my clothes in the washer and took a shower. But so many people live in housing like that. So we're trying to change all that. And the more I can get people to see that bruised and battered body of Christ, but not only to see it, but to be it. If we be it, we have credibility. So all these efforts, I'm getting more and more people to see it, or they're seeing it. The Lord is helping them see it. We've doubled the size of our justice ministry team. And a lot of those people are nurses, teachers. We got a police officer. And they're seeing what's going on. So we doubled the size of our justice ministry team, and we just turned out 200 people to our last action assembly. So things are changing.
Well, good afternoon. My name's Anthony White, and I serve as the lead pastor of Bible-Based Fellowship Church in Tampa and a part of Hope. And I wanted to just, give my reflection on being a battered and bruised church, and the Cardinal really spelled out that it is also the leaders who have to be a part of that. And so our ministry has been a part of Hope now for 3 years, but shameful to say, this past year was my first time actually being a part of the listening process and going to a listening gathering and having that experience of being there with the people of the congregation. So one particular family in our congregation suffered the loss of a son several years ago, and over the course of time, I knew about the loss of their son, but they also have become a surrogate to another son who is not a part of their family, who's not blood related. But this person has challenges. And so I went to their house. They hosted the listening party because he's had particular run-ins with the law, being profiled, and he's a juvenile. But they've stuck with him. And there at the house in the listening party were not only this family, but families from the community that also had similar stories and concerns about justice. And so one of the things, it's really opened my eyes to are the hurting who are not always right in our congregation, but who are also associated with people in our congregation because they live in that community. And so for me, being a part of that whole listening process was a part of myself being the leader who was subjecting myself to being exposed and gaining that insight of those who have been battered and bruised.
I'm John Mark Wiggers. I'm the rector of St. James Episcopal Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, part of Justice Knox, and just rolled off as, thank you, yes, thanks for the knock. Just rolled off as co-president with my twin brother, Chris Battle. I cut my hair, so you can't quite tell we're twins. But St. James is a congregation just shy of 100 years old that's in a neighborhood that's close to homeless shelters. Because of gentrification that's creeping in, we have an excellent coffee shop. It will right across the street from St. James, but you can also buy sex and drugs pretty easily in the neighborhood any time of day. And they have a long history of great mercy ministry, of feeding people, and of getting to know people and building relationships. But in that, justice ministry has answered maybe a malaise or unnamed complacency that was present in that. Because I know for the folks in my congregation, for myself, we'd see the same faces over and over again. And there was that underlying frustration that we're not really changing things for these people. And so it's caused us to ask questions since we've joined with Justice Ministry. We are asking the questions, are we doing the right thing? What more could we do? What are the things at the root of this? It's made our people ask those questions. And I think we've also gotten a little dirtier because we've listened to real stories, and also we've gained a sort of gritty wisdom as we realize that even some of our most beloved public leaders will do everything they can to deny and deflect and divert and try to destroy this kind of work. And an interesting story around that, someone came to me just last week and said, and actually it's a staff member, came and said to me, "I need to apologize to you." I said, "Oh, okay. This could be uncomfortable." And she says, "You know, last year, right after the Justice Ministry action, after the Nehemiah action, I was a little concerned. I felt like this is too confrontational. It's too in your face. This isn't right. And I didn't say anything to you because you were one of the spokespeople up front, and I just thought I'll let it go." But someone in our congregation recently had asked if they could lead a group on Sunday morning during Sunday school reading the letter from a Birmingham jail. And this woman had participated in that. It had about 30 folks together reading it. And we just read through it. We went around the table reading and stopping in places and having discussions. And this woman said to me, "You know, when I read that and realized we have to create some tension, even people of goodwill don't often want to change, don't want to do the right thing. And so sometimes we have to be the ones confronting and creating that tension that brings the change." And so that was a beautiful thing, and I encourage you all to try that in your Sunday school. Go for it. I mean, the letter, I would put it up. I wanted that and Brothers Karamazov, I think maybe should be brought into the canon of Scripture, but that's another day. It's another group, right? And then one of the questions raised as I was preparing for this was, how has this affected my own ministry? For me, it's answered that personally, that call to do something more than just putting a Band-Aid on things. But I had maybe reached that place that Ken and Turkson talked about of being sort of maybe a little burnout and tired, just tired of doing this stuff. Is it, maintaining the building and all those things of worrying about security and safety, and whether it's literally when we lock the doors or when we don't, or the way we do our liturgy, the way we serve, committees, oh my God. And please help us. And I was tired of that. And thankfully, I had a sabbatical about a month after the action. I went on a 3-month sabbatical. And I went reflecting on this, because that night as I was a spokesperson asking leaders to make a change, something shifted in me. I don't know, cracked open in a very positive way. So on my sabbatical, I made a point of going into therapy for that, because there's been a real shift in my personality because of this work that's called me out to be more active, to be more present, to really claim that power working in us. And also, it also drove me inward in some sense, which I guess some therapy is turning inward, but there's something about that turning inward, and also that contemplative prayer, which I kind of think that's what Jesus was doing when he was nodding the whip. He was meditating. He was doing a little centering prayer, folks. And when we do that, and all the other stuff I was doing, it's a lot of noise, and there's a lot of noise when I went inward, when I go inward even now. But when I reach that place of silence and stillness deep in there, that place that knows that I'm loved, that I'm forgiven, and knows that I don't need a sacrifice, that I'm connected with all of these people and all of God's creation, it's then that I'm turned outward to others and to the world. And so there is that way, I think, of going inward and being turned out to get into that world and get dirty and to take that message, because that's what that message that I get when I go inward is what the world really needs to hear, that they are loved and forgiven. And that's the work we're doing with Justice.
Good afternoon. I'm Holly Holcomb. I'm the Associate Director of DART, and I want to do a little postscript to that. Please be back by 8:30 in the morning if you're doing that. So come on back, because tomorrow promises to be stellar. You know, the purpose of this every year is to gather speakers and folks who are in the trenches and be inspired, to be challenged. And would you say we've accomplished that so far? So I want to also extend my appreciation to all of the speakers, Cardinal Turkson, Dr. Pickett, Archbishop Wensky, all the people who've been on the panels and worked hard to think about how they would share with you. We want to also thank them with applause for their work. It's hard work, isn't it? There's a lot of tension in it. But it's good tension, it's healthy tension. It gets us out working with one another in a way that we ought to be doing this, and there's a heck of a lot of courage that we can build together to get the work done. You want to definitely be here tomorrow morning. There are going to be some sermon blitzes that are going to be great and maybe helpful for you, so you don't have to create your own in the next few weeks. You're welcome to borrow those. I want to make just a couple of announcements. Excuse me. It's already been mentioned, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Who knows what that is? Okay, all right. Nearly every organization in this room, in the past or currently, has gotten support from CCHD to build and grow their justice ministry organization. And I want to just acknowledge to them, we also have Ralph McLeod, the director here, and one of the staffers, Randy Kiesler, for the Southern region, so we want to acknowledge your presence. But I think it's good for all of us to recognize the reach of that and the work. So I'm going to do a roll call by states, and as your state is called, your organization, if you would stand and remain standing, and then we'll do applause when we're all done with that. So let's start with Kansas and Indiana. Would you please stand? Virginia and South Carolina, would you please stand? Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, would you please stand? Are you all up? All right. Florida, would you please stand? So let's just acknowledge that the work of the local parishes through the CCHD is generally helping every organization in this room in the work that we're doing together. So thank you for that.
My name is the Reverend Cammie Young. I am on the board of directors for DART. I got started in Jacksonville, Florida 10 years ago, where I was a part of the Jacksonville affiliate there, the Interfaith Coalition for Action, Reconciliation, and Empowerment, also known as Who Cares? Thank you very much, my friends. I moved from there to go to Knoxville, Tennessee, where I worked with folks in the Knoxville area to help to form a new affiliate there that was called Justice. 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 Thank you all very much. So I've got friends all over the country that I can claim both just the great privilege and joy of being a part of this this broken and battered group of people who are helping us to make a world where there is bridging and belonging. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm moved now recently, 2 months ago, to Pensacola, Florida, and I am there now, where I'm joined with 3 of those clergy leaders from congregations there as we lay the groundwork together for a new ministry. I want to stop just to say we've had a lot in this less than 24 hours, for which I am overwhelmingly grateful, and I want to thank especially Cardinal Turkson for his presence among us, for being with us to bear the message of the gospel of joy. Thank you very much again, sir. And I also want to add my thanks as well for having Dr. Pickett among us and for bringing the scriptures alive in a new way that is transforming us. We're going to continue to be inspired as we move forward this afternoon in that same spirit and think together about how justice ministries in our congregations and in our communities can be central and urgent, not just on the side for some. We want to think with a few of our colleagues about how we can move from complacency to urgency, how we can have testimonies from some who have begun to look at what that looks like in their congregations and with their communities. And after we hear from them, we're going to break up into small groups to discuss what that journey might look like in our congregations. Right now, I want to introduce to you Father Nestor Rodriguez, and then our panel at the table here, Pastor Clifton Dollison and Pastor Philip Baber. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. Everybody have a lovely lunch? It's the worst time to give a talk. I hope you don't fall asleep. My name is Nestor Rodriguez. I was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Palm Beach almost 25 years ago. I've been the pastor of St. Anne in West Palm Beach, not to be confused with Palm Beach, the island of Palm Beach. I live on the other side, West Palm Beach. I came to St. Anne in 2011. The justice ministry was already established in my church. In fact, one of my peers, Father John DeMello, who's here, was very instrumental. And so naturally, my first thought was that I would allow it to continue. Prior to my arrival at St. Anne, I was pastor for 11 years at Holy Cross in Indiantown, and that was a rural parish. A lot of undocumented brothers and sisters. So I had a taste of social justice in trying to fight for their rights, for their dignity. But I never quite understood the organized way until I came to St. Anne, began working with peace. We are neighbors. And so, in the beginning, I did what I thought was all the right things. I began talking about justice in my homilies. I attended the team meetings. I attended the 4 large assemblies of the year, the issue committee meetings, and we started having amazing results, or what I thought at the time were pretty good. For example, in Nehemiah Action 2014, we were able to have with us 534 people attend the Nehemiah Action from St. Anne. In 2015, we were able to attract 456 brothers and sisters, and I said, wow, that is pretty good. In fact, I said, wow, that's amazing. Now, the first year I was pretty happy, but by the second year I had come to reflect on and believe in our vision for justice ministry in a much more profound way. Conversion was starting to take place, as many of you in your own ministry have experienced when the blinders begin to be removed. By that time, I had been a priest for 20 years. I realized that in those 20 years as a priest, I had been blind to this part of my faith. My eyes were opened. Justice was a core, essential part of my Catholic belief. The vision was to get everyone in my church to understand this. As some of us have talked about that. To get them to the understanding that doing justice was just as important as doing faithfulness and mercy. To have a conversion experience around justice. This was the vision that I was embracing at this point. So by the second year, 2015, I was no longer happy with 456 people at the Nehemiah Action. Yes, it was cool. That's a lot of people. But why wasn't I happy? I began to question. My church is a very diverse community, made up of Anglos, a Hispanic community, and a very large Haitian community. Among especially our Hispanic community, bringing people to the action was relatively easy. You get a couple of good team members, and they are capable of bringing 50, 60, even 100 people each. They bring their families, their extended families, and their neighbors. But I knew that they were just bodies in the crowd that one night only. It was a blessing to have them, obviously. The numbers are great for the officials to see. But I realized they were not coming to the other meetings, to the other assemblies. They did not, by and large, understand much about social justice. There was very little conversion taking place among my people. I began to make comparisons to other types of conversion. In our Catholic tradition, you all have a different process, perhaps, some of the other denominations. But we have what is called the RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults. And this is the process by which adults over 18 who perhaps were not baptized as children or did not make the sacraments of communion or confirmation, they begin a process of study and conversion, normally starting in September. And then at the Easter Vigil, the night before Easter, they're received into the church. They receive, those that have not been baptized, receive baptism, communion, and confirmation. Now, a candidate for the RCIA program will never expect to sign up for the program and then just show up for the Easter Vigil. It's not going to happen. There's study, there's conversion experience. There are classes, and they get the first class, it's a little dry. The second class, they get into it a little deeper. By the time the Easter Vigil, they're on fire, man. After the Easter Vigil, they want more classes. They want to continue to study their faith. I began to realize that our network members, to think they can sign up and then show up to the Nehemiah Action, wasn't really just working. They really didn't understand. But that is what too many of our network members were doing at my church. I realized, and the result was this: our justice ministry was built on sand. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 to 27, Jesus says these words: "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built the house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Too much was at stake for our justice ministry to fail, to fall. If our justice ministry fell, there would be no solution for the hundreds of churchgoers who were undocumented, living in fear in the shadows. There would be no lasting solution for the hundreds of homeless who came to our church homeless service center. No mercy, no help for them. And perhaps worst of all, if our justice ministry were to fall, our church community itself would fail to fulfill God's mandate that we do justice. My people coming to one meeting a year, that was not fulfilling God's mandate that we be a church that lives justice, that breathes justice. And so I determined to replace the complacency with urgency. Complacency with urgency. Last year's speaker, Reverend Lucky, said this: complacency is not laziness. Complacency is a satisfaction with the status quo. In my context, it was satisfaction with showing up in large numbers each Nehemiah action without most who were there not having a deep understanding of God's call on their lives to do justice. And without having this understanding that doing justice is something to hold in their hearts, to understand more each day, to realize that this was a journey of conversion to justice. And so we have embarked upon that journey where we are building a justice ministry culture. We still have much to do, but here are a few things we've done to try and replace that complacency with urgency. Number one, the Justice Ministry team meets monthly. Doing this keeps the urgency before our team members, and we elevate the importance of the Justice Ministry as we have weekly Bible studies and weekly sacramental preparation. Important ministries minimally get monthly meetings. 2, incorporating justice into our worship. This is happening in a few different ways. I, of course, am preaching on justice more and more, sometimes with fear, trepidation, who's going to confront me afterwards? But more and more, I feel more comfortable because I have come to believe that it is essential to our faith. Our team members speak for 2 or 3 minutes after communion at strategic points throughout the year to give a testimony, to speak on the issues. We added a justice prayer for the prayers of the faithful, the equivalent of the prayers of the people in some Protestant traditions. We've done special prayers during the Mass, particularly for important upcoming meetings with public officials. We do the regular commissionings of the team and the network, but then before the rally and the celebration, we do a blessing of the network members. So the community is exposed to these people who are doing God's work. So it becomes the culture of the parish that we live and breathe. The Saturday night before our Nehemiah Action, we hold the Nehemiah Action Vigil to pray as a parish community for the success of our action. And the vigils really work well with the Hispanic parishes. They love these vigils of worship and praise. It's been 2.5 years since I first had my moment of really conversion has been a process, and I'm still being converted. Realizing that our justice ministry was built on sand. And there's still sand, but it is slowly, slowly being transformed into the rock upon which our justice ministry will stand. And the indicators are these. We have maintained our Nehemiah Action turnout, turning out 497 in 2016 and 485 in 2017. More of our network members each year are coming out to more than just the Nehemiah Action. But of course, an important indicator of our growth is our congregational drive. We've gone from raising under $1,800 in 2015 to breaking $5,000 this past year. We still have work to do. We still have a lot of work to do. Far too many have yet to experience that conversion. Raising more than $5,000 is good, but there were still too many network members who invested nothing. They haven't taken ownership yet. And so, we maintain our sense of urgency and continue the journey. Yes, we do faithfulness. We fill those pews. Yes, we do mercy. We feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prisons. But this justice part, we know it's not easy. Sometimes, yes, we want to despair. It is a challenge, but it is God's work. We all know, without a doubt, this is God's work. Let us not despair when we are challenged. Let us not despair when our parishioners challenge us. Let us not despair when we get tired. The kingdom of God is here. It is urgent that we do this work today. Thank you. God bless you.
I'm here to give my little testimony. And in fact, I was contemplating initially, I was going to entitle this How We Got Our Groove Back. But thought I might handle this in a little different way. I'm Clifton Dollison. Ironically, I'm sitting at the table with another brother named Clifton also. I thought somebody who made the table assignments thought that would be really neat to have two Cliftons sitting at the same table. But that was a good thing. We've got a lot in common as well. I'm Clifton Dollison, pastor of the First Missionary Baptist Church in Winter Haven, Florida. I have served the church for the past almost 26 years, and the longest serving pastor in the church's history. Many did not stay quite as long as I have. But I've been involved in peace for the past 16 years and have been labeled in the community as being a justice pastor. I've always felt the call to do justice. It was not just a requirement of my faith, but something that I, as a leader in the church, certainly an African-American church, did not have the luxury of opting out of. It was at this particular conference several years ago, and they were trying to recruit my church to be a part of Peace Polk County, and I was still kind of vacillating between, what I should do and with all the other stuff that we were doing. Dr. Lithicum was the speaker at the conference, and he challenged all of us, in particular, I think he was speaking to me, that if I was not building the city of God with justice, then I was building the city of Satan. And that same challenge has stuck with me even today. That being said, my congregation did not reflect that same commitment. We fell into what is considered that old, same old, same old. And there were two leaders, two ladies in our church that who are still, amazing at what they were able to do. And they were, turning out significant numbers and getting people to give during our congregational drive. I was preaching about justice, told the people of the need, and we were turning out probably 120 to about 200 people to our action. And to most people's standards, this was, reasonable, fairly good. However, something happened this past summer, and one of my associate ministers, he would often say to me after one of my sermons, he would say, "Pastor, that was somewhere between excellent and perfect." That certainly did my heart a well of good. Those words kind of struck a chord in me, and he said simply, "Somewhere between excellent and perfect." And rather than compare myself to how we were doing compared to other churches, I looked at what possibly we could be doing in our own church. We've got at least 600 souls that come every Sunday who worship, but we did not have 600 people coming to our justice meetings or our action. I realized that I was allowing my congregation to be complacent, and though I said and felt that justice mattered, I did not take the steps necessary to ensure that our justice ministry had indeed was somewhere between excellent and perfect. I realized that our congregation needed to feel the sense of urgency about our justice ministry, not just a month before the action, but consistently. I realized that if I only depended upon those 2 leaders I had currently, who were doing the investing and some of the things we were doing, we decided we would recruit new leaders and developing new leaders, that we would build our capacity to reach that 52-1 and turning out 600 people once a year for justice. So I sat down with our very capable organizer, and I certainly appreciate her on many levels now. We came up with a list of names of the leaders in our church, and we talked about those relationships and those who had followed through and those who would take the initiative and take the lead in helping our justice ministry become what it ought to be. I personally met with each one of those leaders, shared with them my vision. In fact, we went from 2 leaders to 8 leaders this past summer. And every year before this, we had very low turnout for our house meetings, or the house meetings really didn't kind of materialize at all. This year, we had a newly appointed team leaders and stand before the congregation, and I commissioned them to do the work of justice and told every single church member present that if they were to invite it to a house meeting, that they ought to make it very important and do all they could to attend. I prayed for them and blessed them and shared that this is our priority in the church. And every Sunday before each house meeting, I would share when they were happening and encourage the members who had been invited to attend. Well, this created some momentum and made my leaders feel supported, encouraged, credible. And in the eyes of their fellow church members, it went from the average of 1 or 2 house meetings to 8 house meetings with an average of 10 people at each one. There was a new energy in the air. The people were waiting to be invited to the house meetings. People were talking about the stories they heard. People began to understand that they personally had a call to do justice. After all the house meetings were conducted, we recruited 91 network members. The Sunday before our Community Problems Assembly, I had every single network member stand before the congregation. I commissioned them to fulfill the commitment they had made to attend 4 meetings and bring 3 people or more to the action, and had the congregation pray over them, pray for them, for their success. I now have 49 Nats in the running, and we are set up to reach or exceed our goal at a minimum of 200 people at the Nehemiah action. But I'm not satisfied yet. We're not finished. I will continue to recruit more leaders and build urgency with our members, because the work of justice must continue. The work of justice through peace passed the half-cent sales tax that brings in $38 million a year for the poor and uninsured. The work of justice through peace opened 5 clinics that serve over 25,000 people a year. The work of justice through peace saw over 600 people break the cycle of addiction. The work of justice through peace has diverted over 360 children from the criminal justice system. Imagine how much more we could accomplish if every single one of our congregations strive to be somewhere between excellent and perfect. We would bring the city of God to Polk County. I know that this is possible because when peace shows up, show you right.
Good afternoon. My name is Philip Babert. I'm the pastor of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville, Florida. I'm also currently serving as the co-president of ICARE, the Interfaith Coalition for Action, Reconciliation, and Empowerment. I've come to believe in the context of church that justice must be more than merely a committee. It must be our culture. And my faith of Unitarian Universalism compels me to incarnate justice in this world, justice for all. Now, my church is predominantly white and upper middle class, so we have a lot of privilege there, including the privilege to merely discuss the topic of justice in the abstract, perhaps over a cup of coffee. But a justice culture calls us to put down the coffee, to go beyond our church walls and challenge systems that may even personally benefit some of us, though at the cost of oppressing others. So when I became the pastor of my church a few years ago, I inherited a congregation that was already mobilizing many people for ICARE. But there were obstacles keeping us from doing more and doing better. For example, many of my congregants said that they felt somewhat alienated at our assemblies because many of my congregants are not Christian. And these events included a lot of Christian prayer and music. Additionally, if I can be candid, several of my white congregants also needed to learn how to overcome their own discomfort being in predominantly black spaces. So we had a lot of work to do as a congregation learning how to interact graciously and humbly in multi-faith and multicultural spaces. And one sermon a year on the subject of justice wasn't going to fix all of that. We had to find ways to connect the work of ICARE to multiple aspects and expressions of our faith year-round. So we began teaching explicitly on the difference between mercy and justice. We discussed openly how to challenge unfair systems and the tension and conflict that must necessarily accompany that. We have learned that if we are to be on the side of love, that sometimes that means love chooses a side. And perhaps most importantly, we are learning that justice work requires us to be in authentic relationship with people who are very, very different than us sometimes. So when I became the pastor of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville, we were turning out about 100 people a year to our Nehemiah Action, which represented about 80% of our average worship attendance. But I knew that we could do better, and we should do better. And one concrete thing that we did to get better was to anoint one of our members to the role of whip. So our whip created a list of all of our network members who had committed to bring 3 people to the Nehemiah Action. And they broadcast that list along with the actual names of every person whose commitment to attend was secured by one of those network members. We publicized this info regularly through weekly email blasts, social media, etc. The point was to make our Nehemiah Assembly turnout visual and publicly hold every one of us accountable for bringing at least 3 people. This definitely helped to create a sense of urgency. I literally had people from the network call me up and say that when they saw that list for the first time, they got on the phone and started calling their people because they couldn't stand to see all those blanks under their name on that list. They wanted everyone in the church to know that they were going to be people of their word and that they were going to pull their weight. It also helped us to have team leaders who are well-known and well-respected within our congregation. In other words, the leaders of our Justice Ministry Network are not simply the activists that no one ever listens to anymore. Our team captain is a matriarch of our church, a former board president. Our other team leaders are also members of many other vital ministries and committees at our church who have put in many years and are well-loved and respected by many. And another turning point in our justice ministry occurred when I began participating more. I started attending more clergy caucuses, coming to the larger events. I eventually became co-president of our organization. And so my congregants saw me leading by example. And so they felt supported by me. I wasn't just asking them to go anymore. I was going with them. Our church membership has grown because of our role in eye care, because people in the community are seeing and hearing us passionately living our faith. Since I began being more intentional about leading by example, my congregation's Nehemiah Assembly turnout has increased every year. Last year, we turned out 180 people to the assembly, which is about 50 to 60 people more than our average worship attendance on Sunday. So the visible presence of the pastor in the justice ministry has become an important part of our long-term sustainability. Having the right team leaders at the helm keeps our justice ministry going as well, and hardwiring our justice ministry into the DNA of our worship through multiple sermons, commissioning ceremonies, and public accountability, all of this has helped to make justice a part of our corporate identity as a people of faith.